Hey everybody, and welcome to my top 5 tone or preset tweaking or creation tips. Okay, I thought this was an important video to do for the simple fact that I've done numerous videos, dialing in videos, how to create a great tone video, and there's hours of content there. But if I was to summarize my 5 top tips to, not only creating a great preset, but also to tweaking a great preset. Not too long ago, I did a video talking about our monitoring and how it affects what we hear with a preset. So a lot of folks go on custom tone, they download presets by myself, or they download presets by somebody else. And you hear so much talk about how when you play it on your system, it doesn't quite sound the same as what you heard in, say, a demo video or played by somebody else. And that's why I did that monitoring video, because it shows that the monitoring is such an important thing. But here's the thing, what if we get a preset that doesn't sound like we expected it to? How can we, and is there a way to tweak it very effortlessly to have it suit our ideals without changing the entire preset around? Okay, so we're going to talk about some tips with that because I think it's important, but also about creating our own presets from scratch and the top tips that I use that are kind of part of my template, but I want to break them down and really talk about why I do things the way I do them. So let's go over to HXEdit and take a look. So what I've done, I have a little preset here I've called 5 tweak tips. Couldn't think of anything else to name it that fit in the box. So what I've done is I've taken my template and I have turned off all of these blocks, my compressor, my parametric EQ, reverb, delay, low and high shelf, turn them all off. And I've actually flattened out the EQ on the low and high shelf just so that it's not having any effect even when we turn it on. And all I did is simply add in a Brit Plexi Bright amp model with a 412 greenback 25 with a 57 dynamic. Now I turned the low and high cuts off on the cab for a reason we'll talk about in a second. I cranked everything up to 10 except for the drive on 8. I was kind of sort of trying to create a preset that didn't sound wonderful right away. And for good reason, because I want to show how when we're presented with something that maybe doesn't sound the way we want it, how we can use some tone shaping to kind of create something that works better, okay? So here's, first of all, this preset as it is. It's not the worst thing ever, but it's kind of bright and edgy. Here's the other thing. I've said this before in videos. I would never discount a tone like that because that might be the perfect tone for a particular situation, for a particular mix, or to cut through, or maybe it isn't, because maybe it's just something we want to sit and play through our studio monitors. It sounds too abrasive. So there's no right and wrong here, right? And it's also down to personal preference. But for the most part, I would hear that and think, it's a little too edgy and it's probably going to be a little much in a mix unless we pulled it way back and maybe, have it sit at a different place in the mix. So I purposely did that to say, okay, without actually going into the amp and tweaking things, which we obviously could do, what could we do using these other tips that I have? So the first tip that I have is the use of high and low cuts. Okay, so let's talk about that. And a lot of people use these already. There's a lot of debate about where to set them, how low or how high to set them, right? I think most people tend to use them. Now, as of I believe it was software version 2.8, the stock cabs came with them kind of baked in, and I believe the setting is low cut at 80 and high cut at 8 kilohertz, which seems to be actually not a bad place in the cab block, because the cab block is a less dramatic fall off or slope on the cuts versus using, say, the parametric EQ, which I have in my template. That's why I zeroed these off. I'm going to use the parametric EQ. But right now, we were hearing it without any lower high cuts. And if you listen to that upper high end, there's a real abrasiveness. Right, can get kind of piercing. And even in a mix, that could get in the way of the cymbals, and we don't need all that information up there. So if we come over to my parametric EQ here, in my template, I kind of bake those in at 100 Hertz for the low cut, 12 kilohertz for the high cut. Let's just see what turning that on and off does to the preset. So here it again without the low and high cut. And with. Again, please listen on a decent set of headphones or a decent set of speakers. You know, listening on your cell phone might not show what's actually happening here. Listen to that upper high end, those kind of crispy sounds up top. Here it is again without the cuts. And with. We still retain some nice crunch and upper end. But now it's going to probably work in a mix better. It's still going to have that cut, but it's going to sit better. Now, maybe we want a more vintage tone. Maybe we want something that's a little darker and a little bit creamier. Well, simply by rolling back this to maybe, well, let's see what 10 kilohertz does. Okay, let's keep going. Let's go to 8. Kind of warming up, isn't it? Let's go to 7. Let's even go, let's go all the way down to 5 and see what happens. Quite warm now. Now I would worry about that tone being a little too much. That's going to sound good while you're sitting here in front of your monitors, but I think in a mix that's going to get kind of lost. It doesn't have the presence for me. So, you know, if I come back now to 12, what's interesting about that is now that our ears got conditioned to the 5 kilohertz cut, we tend to think, oh, that's better. Then we go back to the 12 and it's like, whoa, that's too bright. But as we play this longer, now when we go back to the 5, it sounds quite dark, right? So no, I'm not saying one of these settings is better than the other. It's really going to be situational. It's going to depend on the situation we're in. The cuts at 5 kilohertz are not going to cut through a mix, but maybe that's what we want. They're going to sound maybe better if we're just sitting in a room playing, you know? Maybe having a happy medium in there at 7 or 8 would be a good place. So when I set mine in my template at 12, that's just a starting point. Everything in the template is a starting point. It's not meant to be baked in. You know, and I've had people contact me, why do you set your, I'm not setting it there. I will change that depending on the context and depending on the purpose of whatever preset I'm making, and you should too. If you downloaded a preset from Custom Tone and on your system there's a little too much of that crunchiness up top, well, roll that back a bit, and that might just fine-tune it to what your system needs, right? Maybe roll it up a bit. It depends on what you need and what your purpose is. We all have different guitars, different hands, different ideals, different ears, different monitoring systems. There is no one-size-fits-all solution for this, and we have to make these tweaks to suit it to ourselves, whether that's a paid preset or whether that's a custom tone preset or whether we're creating our own presets. We have to be able to know what these tools do, and then we can very quickly dial things in using them. Okay, my second tip is the high and low shelf. Now, so many folks who watch my channel know how much I love shelf EQs, and so much that Line 6 folks put the shelf block in because I created the split crossover workaround, and they didn't realize that the shelf EQ was there. Now, this to me is one of the most powerful tools, and there's a very good reason why I include this in all of my presets. Whether you get my stuff off of Custom Tone, you'll notice there's, well, in some of the older stuff, it's the split crossover. In some of it's the tilt EQ. Not as many with the tilt EQ, but same sort of principle. Or there is a shelf EQ, always. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. I always have it in there. You're gonna be hard pressed to find any presets that, since I started using the split crossover, you know, however many years ago that is, a couple of years ago, there's really nothing after that doesn't have one of those things, a tilt, a shelf, or a split crossover. The reason I put it in there is twofold. I love the tone shaping ability without having to pinpoint specific frequencies and cut and boost, which I've done in the past as well, and I still do sometimes. Sometimes that's the thing you need. But the shelf EQ gives us a very quick way, and anybody a quick way, even those who don't really understand EQ well, gives them a very fast way of just entering in and going, you know, this is too dark, I'm gonna brighten it up. This is too bright, I'm gonna darken it up. It's too muddy, I'm gonna take some of the mud away. It needs a little fullness, I'm gonna add some of that. With extremely simple tweaks. Now, there is a little bit of understanding behind EQ frequencies to know what to do, but the settings I'm going to give you here, I think, are just good all-purpose general settings, okay? So if you get a preset that's too dark, you can brighten it up with this. Okay, let's take a look. So here again, I'm going to keep our low and high cuts on, but we're going to come over to our shelf again. I'm going to turn it on. It's not doing anything right now, okay? 0 dB booster cut, 0 dB booster cut on both low and high gain. Now, the frequency that I tend to like to set it on is 650 hertz for both, okay? I really like that as a center point for either adding some brightness or subtracting some brightness, or adding fullness or subtracting fullness. And I like to think of it in those terms: brightness, darkness, fullness, you know, less fullness, slimness, I don't know if that's, anyways. So that is the settings that I use. Now, are there presets that I will change that? Absolutely. If I'm not getting what I want for that, depending on the amp and the microphone combination and everything else, then that's fine. So let's take this preset again, and I think we would probably all agree this is a little on the bright side. Now, I left my low and high cuts a little higher than maybe I would with this, just so I could illustrate the shelf EQ a little bit better. So what would I want to do? Well, the low gain on the low frequency is going to represent my fullness and possible muddiness, okay? Well, I don't think this is muddy or too full. In fact, I'm not disliking that bottom end too much. What I'm thinking, though, is it's a little too much on the top end. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come to all the frequencies above 650 hertz. I'm going to start by rolling them back 1 dB. Now, a lot of folks might go, well, that's not very much. And no, it's not. But you know, sometimes the smallest moves, and I'm not saying that's going to do the job yet, but sometimes the smallest moves make all the difference in the world. You know, we don't always have to hit things with a hammer, right? Sometimes finessing them and a bunch of small moves add up to kind of a nicer tone, right? So let's see what this sounds like before that and then after. Already we're getting a little bit nicer. I'm going to go 2 dB down on that. And here's before. Again, off. off again. So I think you can hear the difference. That's really taken some of that brightness away and made it sound just a little nicer, a little bit fuller sounding possibly, right? I could go down a little more if I wanted. -3. Off. On. And I'm not here to tell you what the right setting is for that. That's going to depend, again. Are we playing it in our room? What's our monitoring system telling us? Are we playing it in a mix? That's going to be totally different. Are we playing it live with the band? That's going to, with what other instruments, right? At what volume? All these things are going to affect it, but knowing that there's such a simple tweak we can make to any preset to tailor it to a situation. You know, a lot of people say, oh, I'm going to use global EQs. Well, global EQ is fine, but it's not going to be the same as having something within our preset that's just going to be able to tailor that preset. The global EQ is good if we get into a room and we notice there's a problem across all of our presets, right? But that's not what this is about. And global EQ also doesn't work in this situation where I'm over USB to the computer too. So that's another thing to keep in mind. A lot of folks ask me, why don't you just use global EQ? Because it doesn't work for me in the studio and it's not going to help me at all. So I would say 3 dB. Maybe a little much. Let's go, let's see what 1.5 does. Off. Let's go to 2. How's that? Yeah. Let's go here. Okay, I'm happy with that. So that's pretty good now. Let's do this. Let's see what happens when we just go, and I'm just going to use this. I'm going to go to the multi-output here so it sends this amp straight through the top path. That's why I kept everything down here. So I can bypass all my EQs at the bottom, and then by just picking path 2A, now I'm hearing it through this path, okay? So here it is with none of the high or low cuts or high or low shelf. Now with. So I think you can see how much we can shape that tone with a couple simple tools. We pick where we want our high and low cuts. Maybe we want to go, you know, a little lower with those yet. Maybe we want to go there. What if we try down to 8? Let's do this. Let's stick around. Let's meet halfway here. Let's go to 9. Again, without those settings. And with. Now, is that better? Well, that's up to you to decide, right? And that's going to be up to personal preference, like I said, your monitoring system, and a million other things. So all this is about is not telling you whether that's good or bad, but how we can use the tools to tweak things in the way we need to tailor an existing preset that we got off somebody else, our own preset, maybe a different monitoring system, whatever it might be. Okay. So my third tip is using reverb or ambient effects, some sort of ambient effect. Could be a little bit of delay, could be reverb. The reason I say this, and a lot of folks might automatically go, no, I don't like reverb, I'm not a reverb fan. And I'm not talking about putting like a big hall reverb or a big plate reverb on something. What we have to realize, back in the day of recording guitar amps with a microphone in front of them, there was always somewhat of a room sound on that microphone. There could not be any other situation. It has to be like that. When that guitar amp is playing the sound into the room, it's going to, whatever the acoustics of that room are going to bounce around. It's going to somehow come back and bleed into that microphone somewhat. And that's part of the character of the sound. So what we realize is, a lot of folks don't realize is that we've never heard a perfectly dry guitar tone that was recorded with a microphone. It's almost impossible. We'd have to be in a very special room with almost no reflections, And you know, so and I guess that's that. You know, it's possible to get that situation where we minimize that effect. But I think for the most part, we do hear room sound. Even when we're standing in a room, we're hearing the reflections of the reverb of that particular space. The problem with recording direct guitar through modelers is that we don't have any of that, right? It's the sound of a microphone recording that speaker, but without any of those room qualities. So one thing I like to do is, at absolute minimum, on every tone, put a room reverb, okay? And I'll just turn this on. And it's a fairly small room reverb. A mix I usually set around 30%, but again, this is up to you to change to suit what you want, just to give it a little bit of the sound in the room. I have a decay of 5, okay? So let's listen to this before, without that. You'll really hear it on headphones. It's bone dry. On. Now, obviously, somebody could come and say, oh, I want more reverb than that. You know, go with a higher decay and a higher mix. As we do that, it makes the sound of our direct guitar kind of pull back in the mix. We could even just do the higher mix with the lower decay. To simulate, you know, a bigger space or a different space. But usually my starting point is around 5 on the decay and 30. Again, this is designed to be tweaked by the end user, but that's enough to just give it some space in the mix. So again, let's take the EQs and the reverb out of the equation, and it sounds like this. We bring the EQs and reverb back in. And we've shaped a tone that actually was kind of abrasive and maybe not great to begin with, and now it's starting to become quite usable in some very simple steps. The other thing we could do is also use a delay for the same purpose. We could turn that on, and we could set the feedback to 0, so it only gives 1 repeat. We could turn this over to milliseconds and, you know, I don't know, go 50 milliseconds, let's say. Bring that mix up. Could even lower this to 35. Lower our mix a bit. With that off. You know, that's another option, but I tend to stick more with the reverb, right? My next tone tip is compression. Now, a lot of folks who've watched my channel know I'm a fan of compression, but it's not what you think, you know? And here, I've said this so many times. So many folks think of compression as, you know, a compressor at the beginning of the chain really squashing the signal. And when I talk about compression, mine is more about using it as glue to get it to sit in a mix better and add some gooey character to the tone, okay? And as most of you know, one of my favorites is to use the LA Studio comp at the end of the chain, right? Now, for this one, I've already tweaked this a little bit to get the settings to what I wanted to showcase here. Something to keep in mind. Some folks have said to me, oh, your compressor at the end, now that we have the gain reduction meters, it's not even moving when I put an amp in. And I said, well, yeah, because I haven't set this. This is a starting point. It really depends on what you feed into it. If you feed a very high level of signal into it, you're going to get way more gain reduction and way more compression. If you feed a very low level signal, maybe you're going to get no compression. So keep that in mind. You need to dial this in for the particular situation. As I've said recently in the video I did about gain reduction meters for 2.9 update, I actually go for about 1 to 3 dB of gain reduction, maybe 2 dB. So I've set this up to get that. If you've noticed, the settings I had to use were peak reduction of 4 because I have everything pretty cranked over here. Channel volume's up, everything's pretty dimed. It's sending more signal into the LA Studio Comp. A different amp might send a different amount of signal depending on where we have our channel volume and our master and everything else, how much signal's coming out of it, right? So I set it up so that it's very close, turned on and off. I pulled the level back by 1.8 dB because I have the gain up to 5 and the peak reduction at 4. And this is giving me just about 2 dB of gain reduction on this preset. Let's listen to it without. With. Without. With. Now, some folks may like that, some folks may not like that, and it's as easy as turning it on or off. I'm not here to tell you you have to do it, but I find, and when thinking about using these in a mix or in a live band situation, it helps that to just kind of sit there and it glues things together. And again, the big controversy is I don't need to hear anybody tell me for the 4 millionth time, I don't put compression after time-based effects because this is what everybody always does when I do a video like this. And I've explained that a million times. I'm using this in a very subtle manner behind very subtle effects, right? And just as a glue. So I'm using it like a mastering engineer would, very subtle amount. So I'm very aware of the idea of putting compression before or after time-based effects, but there's a very specific reason I do it. So with that on then, here, oops, I'm sorry, with that on then, this is what we have. Let's compare that to all of that signal path gone. So here's just the amp module. With the processing. And it's as simple as saying, okay, you know what, maybe that's a little bit too dark. Okay, let's bring this back up just a hair. Maybe bring this back up to 10. Again, without the processing. With. All right, so I hope you guys like all of that so far. Tip number 5 is using the right amount of distortion. And you might say, well, what do you mean the right amount? And that, again, is really going to be up to personal preference. Sometimes, though, if something isn't sitting right in a mix, whether live or in the studio, it could be because we either have A, too much distortion, or B, too little distortion. Now, that might sound kind of contradictory, but let me tell you why I say that. If I was to come to our drive control here and crank that up to 10, now, that's getting pretty saturated, where it's almost compressing the sound too much. So as we add more distortion, more compression, natural compression from the amp comes in. You listen to the pick attack. And let me even just turn the compressor off at the end. Okay, that's with no compression. Now, let's pull that back to, let's say, 7. Back to 10. Do you hear the effect I'm talking about? This super saturation adds this kind of funny compression on our pick attack. It's oversaturated, and that can actually work against that sitting in a mix properly. It'll pull it maybe back. It won't help it to cut through as much. So actually by getting away from the drug of more overdrive, which I call it that because it's addictive, we think it's doing good, and then we check it out later and it's like, oh wait, there's way too much of that. I could pull this even back to 6, let's say, and see what we have. Versus where we had it at 8. Back to 6 again. So sometimes we put so much distortion because it's a bit of a crutch, right? And it's not going to help our tone to sit in the mix. And again, there's no right and wrong necessarily here. This is going to be personal preference, but it's something, this is more food for thought, all of these things. Keep these things in mind so that when you're tweaking a tone, you go, wait, that's just, maybe I'm going to dial the distortion back. Maybe I'm going to go to the lower and high shelf and do this, Does the opposite apply with a clean tone? I'm not set up for a clean tone here, but sometimes we think of a clean tone as having to be sparkly clean, but in a mix, actually a little bit of edge of breakup is going to help it cut through while still sounding clean until we hear it out of the mix and we go, well, that's not really all that clean, but it sounds clean, in the mix because everything else is kind of on top of it. And that little edge of breakup is helping it to cut through, which is a really important thing. So just food for thought again. So the amount of distortion we use is important. And sometimes I would say in the case of distorted tones, opt for a little less. And sometimes in the case of clean tones, opt for a little more. And in conjunction with all these other tools we talked about today, it's really going to possibly help us. Now, when I create a tone, some of my marketplace stuff, some of my multi-snapshot custom tone stuff, I will do like an extra 1 or 2 snapshots where I go really crazy on the distortion. And it's not really meant to necessarily even be used. I just give people the options because there's some times where you want something that sounds like it's about to explode and just crazy, right? So it's there. But if you notice in my demo videos and whatnot, usually I tend to maybe showcase those, but they're not really what I want to go after. I kind of want to stay in that mid-range, from what I call the push sounds, which are a little edge of breakup, up to like the overdriven sounds to give us stuff more in this department. That level of overdrive. Now, obviously, different styles of music are going to require different things, but even in metal, less distortion sometimes just helps things sit in the mix. So again, it's just food for thought. All right, guys, I think I covered everything I wanted to. I hope you guys enjoyed that, and I hope there's some tips in there. Number 1, to help you to create better presets on your own. But number 2 also, that when you do download something from Custom Tone or Marketplace or purchase off of a preset builder, realize that there's no way that any preset is going to just magically work on absolutely every system out of the box. It can't because of, and please go watch my video on monitoring. I think it's a very important video to understand, and I'll try to link that below here, to understand why things vary so much. Different guitar, different player, different room, different monitoring system, different ideals, different expectations, right? If we have the idea in our mind that a certain sound is what we like and something doesn't match up to it, we automatically think, oh, well, that's no good. But then you try it in another situation, actually, this works really well cutting through a mix. Maybe our ideals or our original thoughts weren't going to help our preset cut through the mix, so something new might. So anyways, just some food for thought about how you can tweak your own presets, tweak existing presets you have, or create your own presets. And I hope those tips help, and those are things I use all the time to alter things and make them work in mixes and outside of mixes and to whatever the situation needs. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. I hope I didn't go on too long about that, and I hope there was some useful tips for you in there. I'll be back really soon. Please like the video and share it if you don't mind. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and hit the bell notification so you get notified when I do new videos. And I will be back very soon with some more content. Thank you guys again. Ciao for now.